Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'll just take you to the present. My current position with FDA is working as a regional food specialist, and I work with the state and local health departments that do inspections for what we call retail, which is any food that goes directly to the consumer. FDA also does inspections for manufactured food. I don't work in that area. Again, it is with state and locals that do inspections, and that's how I kind of originally crossed paths with, originally it was Bill Menke, and started working with the Forest Service on training courses related to the food unit leaders and your camps. So it's a very exciting and very different kind of challenges that you all face that really makes me think outside the box. And gosh, this webinar is a great example of this. Every time I did one once before, and I think, why can't we do this in FDA? It's just such a great medium to do this because we're national. So appreciate being a part of this. Maybe someday we'll catch up with you guys. I am going to talk a little bit today about food safety. I want to go over the hazards of concern associated with your food service operations and why we worry about them. I want to talk a little bit about some strategies for assessing the degree of control of these hazards. And I'll talk about some additional tools and a couple of updates. Forward. Why isn't that working? There we go. Maybe I didn't click in the right spot. Where's my mouse? Okay. I do want to do a little review of the hazards associated with foods. Again, I know this might be review for a lot of people, but just to get everybody on the same page. And it's important that we remember the distinctions and differences between the different hazards, because that's how we're going to really want to set up controls based on their characteristics and assess whether your operators have got these controls adequately in place for these hazards. And so we'll talk briefly about the bacterial, viral, and parasitic organisms that can make people sick when they're associated with foods. We can group these hazards into 4 different types, and again, keeping the characteristics in our head is important when we're taking a look at the food to see whether the controls are adequate. And these include our non-spore forming bacteria, and these, we often talk about these as in terms of vegetative organisms. We do have several spore forming bacteria that present a little bit different challenges for controls. I'll mention parasites, although they're probably a lower risk for the kinds of foods that are being served in your camps, and then the viruses, which is really our big concern. The non-spore forming or vegetative bacteria are the things that are commonly found on all kinds of raw animal foods, meat, fish, eggs. In recent years, we've had more and more problems with some of these organisms on our fresh produce, fruits, and vegetables. Although, I got to say, in the last 2 or 3 years, it seems like the number of outbreaks has sort of steadied or gone down. We're getting a better handle on them, but we continue to have sporadic and often large outbreaks associated with our fruit and vegetables with these vegetative organisms. And examples of these are Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria. There was a big Listeria outbreak associated with cantaloupe from Colorado a few years ago. You may remember reading about. Vibrio is really with our seafood, which you guys don't serve much of, so not an issue probably for you. Staph, this is one that comes from us, commonly associated just on our hands, our nose, our mouths, and Yersinia, commonly associated with milk and milk products that haven't been pasteurized. There's a whole bunch of different vegetative organisms that can be associated with these products. The control measures are pretty straightforward, though. Cooking, right? Our animal foods, we want to cook those so that we can eliminate these bugs. People can carry them, so having no bare hand contact or hand washing and not having sick employees work, in case they are carrying them, is important. And of course, all the temperature controls for either keeping foods cold or keeping foods hot, so that if any of these organisms are present, they don't grow to higher numbers. That's what those holding hot or holding cold really prevents. Now our spore formers. These present a little bit different challenges. Probably the best analogy to have people really understand the difference with these is to think of it in terms of a seed. The spores are a dormant stage for the bacteria, and there's 3 organisms we worry about with food that have spores that you see listed there. It's a dormant stage. However, once the conditions become right, those spores can begin to grow. And so they need to have moisture, warm temperature, those kinds of things. So we expect them to be there. They're part of the dust. They're in the soil. We can't get rid of the spores in our food. But what we can do, if you look at these control measures, is make sure we don't provide the conditions in our food that would allow them to grow to numbers and make us ill. So if we're worried about our spore formers, proper cooling, proper hot and cold holding, and making sure we reheat up to 165, it will at least control perfringens. And the picture there, you can see we have this really deep container of rice. Being able to cool that fast enough, we would expect spores to be there. Rice comes, from the environment, is going to be impossible in my estimation, and we would have real concerns about a situation like this, and having particularly Bacillus cereus when associated with rice being able to grow and make people sick. So again, keep in mind, if we think about our non-spore formers, it's really our cooking, our hygiene, and again, our holding. With our spore formers, cooking won't get rid of them. It's our proper cooling and our holding and our reheating. Little different controls. I will mention the parasites again. It's not something that's typically very common in food. I'm sure you guys recognize Giardia, Cryptosporidium, Cyclospora. These are often water-associated problems, not so much with food. But just to keep in mind, even the tapeworms, Trichinella, historically associated with pork, but bear meat is probably where we see most of the outbreaks now. And the anisakiasis with fish. You guys don't have a lot of fish on the menu. But it really reminds us about the importance of our food service operations, making sure they get their product from an approved source. Because many of the outbreaks that we have with, like I said, Trichinella and the parasites is because they've gotten people have eaten recreationally caught, hunted, whatever, meat products. So they need to make sure they get their food from an approved source. And the final one is the viruses. And these present their own unique problems. Now, the difference with the viruses from our bacteria is that we're trying to control for those bacterial, either the spores or the non-spore formers. We want to control it so that we either kill them with heat or don't allow them to grow to high numbers. Viruses don't grow in the food. Viruses come from us. These are people. And it's a fecal-oral mechanism. If people are sick with have either hepatitis or norovirus, hepatitis A, the hepatitis B is bloodborne. Hepatitis A is the one associated with food. If they are carrying either one of these viruses, they will be shedding them in their feces, and if they come to work when they're sick, and they don't wash their hands properly and have bare hand contact, they can contaminate the food. But they won't grow to high numbers in the food. We really want to prevent contamination from occurring. And I'll go through a little bit of math to kind of show you why we have concerns about this. Now this comes from the Center for Disease Control, and it shows the percentages of the different organisms that are causing illness. And what hopefully jumps out at you right away is to see norovirus right at the top. And let me just talk about hepatitis for a minute before I jump into that, my mistake. Keep in mind, hepatitis presents some significant challenges because hepatitis is a virus that somebody can contract and be shedding in their feces for up to a month before they even have a symptom. They have no idea they have this. They could have eaten somewhere and contracted it and have no idea. And they are shedding it, and it's a great example of why having, even if they don't realize they're sick, having proper hand washing and no bare hand contact is so important, because they're coming in because they're not feeling sick. However, they still are shedding this organism in their feces. So hepatitis is a good example of why that has to be in place all the time. The noro, on the other hand, is generally a fairly mild illness of nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. However, if you look at the numbers from CDC, you can see that this is the major problem that we have with foodborne outbreaks. Almost 60% of our outbreaks are caused by norovirus. If you look at our salmonella, it's closer down to 10%, down here at 11. Clostridium perfringens, this is one of our spore formers. Perfringens is commonly associated with roasts and gravies. These are hard things to cool, right? A big roast, big pieces of meat. And those spores, again, they don't get cooked out through the cooking process for that roast. If it doesn't cool fast enough, they can grow to high numbers and make people sick. And you see that here with 10% of the outbreaks being associated with perfringens. Campylobacter, very close as well at 9%. This is commonly associated with raw chicken cooking. Adequate cooking and not cross-contaminating would prevent it. And then staph, again, I mentioned. Staph infections are commonly found in our hands and cuts. And if staph's transmitted to food, they can grow to high numbers and produce a toxin and make people sick. But it should be pretty apparent that the number one problem here and our number one area of concern is this norovirus at 60%. If nearly 60% of our outbreaks are caused by norovirus, where would it make sense for you to put 60% of your time and energy when you're doing any kind of inspection or evaluation within your food service operations? When I first started working, first training course that we did with the Forest Service back in Boise a number of years ago, I heard about Camp Crud, and it made me think about, well, I wonder if this is associated with norovirus. You know, maybe some of this might be sort of an undetected noro problems underlying through the camps. It spreads very easily and would be a concern within that kind of environment. When I did the course, we did a course about a month ago in the Forest Service facility up in Redmond, Oregon. And I brought this question up, and one of the people there said, no. Camp Crud, it's really about getting a cold or maybe smoke. It's that upper respiratory issues. And one of the reasons I'm still suspicious is that when people have noro outbreaks or when facilities have noro outbreaks, there's always sort of this coded language that goes with it because people don't want to really talk about what happened. And it happens on cruises all the time. That's the big place that you may have heard in the news, that the cruise ships, people are in close quarters and easy to spread in that kind of environment, same kind of issues you would face in a camp. And so what they call it is these nice names like stomach flu. In schools, they call it winter vomiting sickness. They don't want to talk about the fact that this is people eating poop, and that's what's happening. And so I still had some suspicions after I left the class in Redmond. And I thought about it a little bit, and I thought, well, I'm going to go, and I went to Google. And I just Googled Camp Crud and read some really interesting stuff. But I want to read you one quote that I found from a blog. And this came from a chaplain working in a camp in Antarctica. The Camp Crud, he writes, you can't have over 1,000 people serving out of the same dishes without having an occasional outbreak of the crud, even with a huge emphasis on hand washing. Between the ultra dry weather and the almost constant hand washing, I think my skin's about to fall off my hands. I seem to catch the crud about the second week every time I deploy. This one is no exception. And this is the sentence that I really caught my attention. At least I have the respiratory kind and not the gastro whatever. So that kind of supported my questions about whether this might be something that is sort of at an underlying level within the camps that might not be recognized because it's just sort of this general crappy crud. And so I think it's an issue that you need to think about. And let me show you some more information about why this is important and why it's so hard to deal with, again, particularly in the kinds of settings in your camps. And this includes food service, but of course it's questions to think about as far as the larger camp sanitation. So norovirus in particular, we'll use the numbers for it. If somebody is actively shedding this, they are at their peak, they can be shedding 1 trillion organisms, virus particles, in 1 milliliter of feces. So a lot of people will look at that and say, wow, I don't get a milliliter of fecal material on me, my hands when I go to the bathroom. I have had norovirus, I have kids, many, many times. And for those people who've had it, they will know and tell you that a lot of material gets into a lot of places. And I don't think that this is really something outrageous to consider when somebody's really having a bad episode. But if you're not comfortable with that, you can cut it in half, whatever you want to do. Just follow me through the numbers. So you have you start with 1 trillion virus particles. Proper hand washing, 15 to 20 seconds, soap, paper towels, all that, will give you at best a 2 to 3 log reduction. That means you can knock off 2 of these zeros. We still have, what is that, 10 billion organisms left? Okay. We know from studies that up to 100 million organisms can be transferred from an ungloved hand to food, from studies that have been done. The problem is that it only takes 1 to 10 particles to make you sick. So if anyone wants to argue about the numbers up here or the amount, that's fine. But I think if you take a look at what you are starting with and what it takes to make somebody sick, it's pretty apparent how difficult this is to control if somebody is really at their peak shedding for this organism. And that's why we put so much emphasis on the 3 legs of the stool that FDA promotes for contamination, for protection from contamination for viral agents. We have to have an exclusion and restriction policy to make sure that employees do not come to work sick. Now, I gave you the example of hepatitis, so people sometimes they don't realize they're sick and they're going to come. And that means we have to have the other 2 in place with proper hand washing and no bare hand contact. The other problem is, I don't know how it's handled in your camps. If you have a food unit and they have a sick employee, do they have backup personnel? I would think it's going to put them in a difficult position in many times. And we see that all the time with commercial, outside restaurants and food service, that people come to work when they're sick. Sometimes your best employees are your worst enemy, that they feel responsible and they get themselves in there even when they don't feel well. That's why having this alone is not going to be adequate. We also have to have the other 2 legs of this 3-legged stool. We need to have proper hand washing, but remember the numbers. Even with proper hand washing, we're only going to get this 2 to 3 log reduction. So this, in and of itself, hand washing is not going to give us adequate protection, which is why we have to have that 3rd leg to make this work, which is the no bare hand contact with ready-to-eat foods. You take away any one of these legs from the stool, and the system doesn't work. They all 3 have to be there to have an effective employee health and hygiene policy for your food operators. All right, here's a question. Let everybody think about it for a minute. Hand antiseptics are effective at deactivating foodborne viruses and killing parasites. Do you think that is true or false? In fact, this is false. The hand antiseptics really are designated for working on bacterial agents that would be on the hands. Viruses have an envelope around them that the alcohol is not able to get to, and it won't work on them. So viruses and parasites, it's not effective. And a number of years ago, there was a great deal of interest in using this as a substitute. And in fact, CDC had approved the use of hand sanitizers in hospital settings between patients, sort of as a speedy way for them to do something between patients. And FDA has never accepted the use of this in lieu of hand washing because food service is very different. People in healthcare settings don't have a lot of fats and oils and proteins all over their hands. Their hands are pretty clean to start with. And in food service setting, it will not, if there are proteins or fats or oils or anything on the hands, even for the bacterial agents, the sanitizers won't be able to penetrate and get through. So not a substitute for hand washing. Great thing in addition to it, but proper hand washing is the only thing that's going to be effective in removing viruses from the hands. Again, only 2 to 3 log reduction though. Other things to keep in mind when we're thinking about our hazards. For our bacterial, our vegetative and spore formers, they're not very good competitors. If you have foods, and it's the case with a lot of our produce that have other non-pathogenic bacteria on them, it's going to be difficult for them to compete. And I'll talk in a couple of minutes about how that's actually employed within food manufacturing. The pH and water activity, you guys don't have reduced oxygen packaging, so I won't talk about that. But that's something to think about too. That can really affect how much any bacterial agents can grow. Doesn't affect viruses, remember, because they don't grow in foods. And of course, time and temperature, and that's the most common one that we can use in a retail food setting. And what we're trying to do really with that time and temperature is if bacteria, this shows how bacteria grow over time, they can grow to these very high numbers, and this is what we're trying to prevent, to these high numbers in growth, by using time and temperature to prevent that. And that's what those time and temperature parameters that are in the code are really designed to do. And again, it works on everything except for our viruses because they don't grow in the food. The way we're going to prevent viral illnesses is from our 3 legs of the stool: not working when you're sick, washing hands, and no bare hand contact. And these approaches are easily monitored and not only affect the food mentally, they improve it often, cooking, keeping it cold, etc. Here's another question to think about. The temperature danger zone is 41 degrees to 135. Is it true or false? Bacteria of foodborne significance generally do not grow above 127. Would you think about it for a minute? And the answer to this one is that this is actually true. And this is based on the growth of Clostridium perfringens, that spore former that I mentioned before. Clostridium perfringens likes it warm. Again, I said it's often associated with outbreaks with roasts. But it cannot grow above 127 degrees. It's the most heat-loving of any of our foodborne pathogenic organisms. But then the question is, well, why do we have that set at 135? For those of you who's been around for a while, you remember we used to have it at 140, and we lowered it to 135 because of this information on perfringens. But we still have a little bit of wiggle room in there because we recognize that we can have products with different densities, different thicknesses, and that our holding temperature is not going to be perfectly even in all instances. So we have a little bit of wiggle room in there and set it at 135. That's what the regulatory community agreed on. Also points out to remind everybody that those time and temperature parameters that we have in the food code, 135 is based on perfringens, 41 is based on Listeria, the growth of Listeria monocytogenes. These are based on real organisms and specific targeted control of those organisms. Often in manufacturing, they will use something we call the hurdle effect, that they may not have water activity and pH low enough to prevent the growth of any organism on its own, but if they work together, it becomes enough hurdles that any pathogens that might be there can't get going. And I'll talk about some examples of that in a minute. I also want to talk about the definition of a potentially hazardous food, which we now refer to as TCS, or time temperature control for food safety. It essentially means what products need temperature control to be safe. And And so what you'll see in the definition of the 2013 Food Code is that it means a food that requires time temperature control for safety to limit pathogenic microorganism growth or toxin formation. So we have to have time or temperature control for these foods. Oops. And so this includes animal foods, raw or cooked, any cooked plant foods. These got to be refrigerated or held hot. It includes some specifics that we've had outbreaks: our garlic and oil mixtures, raw seed sprouts, cut melons. When they're whole, they're okay, but once they're cut, they need to be refrigerated. Cut tomatoes have been added, and cut leafy greens have been added to this list, again, based on outbreaks. And any other food that has a pH or water activity that comes out in Table A or B, which I'll show you in a minute, as needing product assessment or not needing time temperature control to be safe. And I'll show you a couple of tables that you'll see in the food code. It's not probably something that you would use, but it's the thought process behind how they're set up that I think can be extremely useful when you're looking at a food service operation. So Table A really would be used more for food processing type situations. The food is cooked and then packaged. So the cooking has gotten rid of all the vegetative organisms, and it's packaged hot, so cross-contamination can't occur with something new. The only thing left that we're concerned about now is those spores. So because we only have to control for those three organisms, for Bot, perfringens, and bacillus, we have higher water activity and pH is allowed without refrigeration. For those situations where it's cooked and packaged, we would allow up to a pH value of 5.6. I think if I push it, lights up. With a water activity of 0.92 or less, wouldn't need refrigeration. If we have a pH of 4.6 or less, but we have water activity all the way up to 0.95, wouldn't need refrigeration. It wouldn't be till we got to these much higher combinations out here where we would really need, we call it product assessment. They would have to refrigerate it or give us lab evidence as to why not. Again, not something you guys are going to run into routinely, but to just keep in mind that packaged foods have higher allowances for these water activities and pH before they need to be refrigerated. The one that we're going to use, really, the thought process and parameters that we would use for food service are really going to be found in Table B. These are foods that are not heat treated, or they are heat treated, but they're not packaged, so they could get recontaminated. Now we need not only the spores, but now we have to worry about our vegetative organisms. And in this case, our values go lower, you'll see on the table. Down to 4.2, that 5.6 is gone, and our water activities as well have dropped down for the allowance. So we need to have a water activity of 0.88 to make it a potentially no refrigeration, or this lower 4.2 pH. And again, when we get out to these higher pH and water activities, they would have to keep these refrigerated or held hot unless they could provide lab evidence. Again, not something you guys are going to run into. I think the real value is seeing how pH and water activity can work together, not just one factor or the other. The definition in the food code also contains what is not need refrigeration. That includes an air-cooled hard-boiled egg, not water-cooled, but air-cooled if the shell is intact, does not need to be refrigerated. Pasteurized eggs with the shell intact, probably not something you guys are likely to run into. Hospitals use them sometimes, and they have a little P stamped on them. They're more expensive, but they would not need to be refrigerated. Or any food that they can demonstrate with lab evidence that it won't grow any of our pathogens. So here's a little quiz that I do in a lot of the classes. I'll just walk through it and explain why they're on this list, since I can't talk to everybody here. But Do these foods need to be refrigerated? Cheddar cheese does need to be refrigerated. The reason this is on this list is because although it needs refrigeration, our hard cheeses are exempted from date marking. Date marking is a control for listeria, and we have received laboratory evidence that these hard cheeses cannot grow listeria. However, we don't have evidence that all types of cheddar do not need refrigeration. There could be other organisms, if they became contaminated, that could grow in it. So we do require cheddar cheese to be refrigerated, just not date marked. Seed sprouts were on the list, absolutely need refrigeration. Pasteurized skim milk needs refrigeration, although it's been pasteurized. If any cross-contamination with anything else did occur, it'd be a perfect medium for it to grow. Remember the cooked vegetables? When the can of green beans, they've been heat treated, the canning process. When the can of green beans is closed, no problems. But once you open that can, if it became contaminated from something else, it could grow, or pathogens could grow in there. We talked about the cut melons, of course, need to be refrigerated along with the garlic and oil. Unpasteurized orange juice. Now, think a minute about the pH and water activity that I just talked about. What's the pH of orange juice? I'm not really sure myself. I ever look it up every once in a while, and then I forget the exact number, but I know it's very acidic, and it's well below the 4.2 on that other chart. So it technically would not meet the definition here of requiring refrigeration. We do because of quality issues, but we've had outbreaks associated with orange juice. But the problem has been with those outbreaks is that the orange juice was contaminated from the source. It wasn't growing. We've seen that with apple ciders. If you remember the peanut butter outbreak a few years ago, we had salmonella in peanut butter, and that happens every once in a while. It's not growing in there. It got contaminated from the source. So we can still have outbreaks from foods that don't need to be refrigerated for safety. They need to be processed safely is the issue there. Pre-washed lettuce salad. Years ago, a few years back, we didn't. The answer to this would have been no, but now we've added cut leafy greens because of our outbreaks. So number 8 would indeed fall into this. Sour cream. Sour. So we know the pH is low. It's not as sour as orange juice. So this one is on there again to make people think a little bit about that pH and water activity interaction. And what we found by talking, actually the state of Oregon worked with a number of their creameries, talking to them about what the pH of their final product was, is that sour cream needs to be refrigerated. There may be some sour creams that come out that have low enough pH, but unless they can prove it, it needs to be refrigerated. However, it's still a low risk, right? We don't have a lot of big outbreaks with sour cream. Thousand Island dressing. All commercially prepared salad dressings are considered by FDA to be non-TCS. They have preservatives and pH that are low enough. However, if they make this from scratch, all bets are off. Now we have a different animal, and they would have to either demonstrate that it doesn't need to be refrigerated or keep it cold. Butter, another one of these, what's the pH? Nah, it's not real tart. What's the water activity of butter? Not a lot of water in it, right? It's not real liquidy. And a lot of salt in most butter. So the answer to this one went round and round for years and years, is that technically it does meet the definition of a food that needs to be refrigerated. However, keep in mind we've had very few outbreaks associated with this product. I bet most of the people listening have butter out at home. Very common practice. It's still a low risk, but technically it would meet the definition and need to be refrigerated. Margarine, on the other hand, is made from oil. It is considered non-TCS. It does not need to be refrigerated. And finally, pumpkin pie. We had years ago pumpkin pie letters FDA used to release because the manufacturers came up with formulations using that hurdle concept I mentioned, where they lowered the pH, they lowered the water activity, they put in some preservatives, and they created enough hurdles and provided the test evidence to say that, even if we contaminated it with different organisms, they can't grow in here. And so it's just another example of that hurdle concept that food manufacturers can use. Again, not trying to get you to memorize them, it's just to help people use this thought process when you walk into a situation and say, what's going on here? What are my hazards? And what am I going to do? Do I need to throw this out? Can I allow them to reheat it? It's a tough situation for all of us to give you sort of some tools to use to think through the processes as you run into them. And again, now I want to switch over and talk a little bit about the risk factors and focused on the focused inspection, to really be able to assess whether your facilities have got the kind of controls that they need to have in place to make sure that food is safe. So what we've really been working with inspectors on is really realizing that we all have limited time when we're in these facilities, and you guys have some advantages because you can go in there multiple days. For a local inspector, it's maybe twice a year if they're lucky. But if you're going in on different days, to maybe think about what am I going to focus on each time and what would be my priorities, and that those priorities should be based on compliance with those risk factors. The source, cooking, holding times and temperatures and equipment, and hygiene. Those are our priorities to really spend on because we know those are the things that are causing foodborne illness. And whether or not your food service managers have really got a system to control those risk factors. Now, we call them the good retail practices, the GRPs that you see down here, the kind of floors, walls, and ceiling issues. Those also are assessed. We're not throwing those out the window, but we want to consider time constraints and this idea of whether they're static or in motion. If you go into a facility and they're really ramped up cooking burgers, assessing the cooking temperature is really your priority. And if you, on the other hand, see that the screen door is not shutting tightly, that will still be broken tomorrow or in an hour, but those burger cooking, you may not get another chance to really assess that. So let the static things sit. You can deal with them when you have time, and set your priorities based on those risk factors. And in that kind of situation, it would be the cooking. It's important to have an understanding of the preparation processes for each one of your operators. A good example would be if you have an operator who's making, say, macaroni salad, that's on the menu that they're going to serve, it really makes a huge difference to focus your inspection to understand whether that's something they make. Do they boil the noodles and cool them? Do they add hard-boiled eggs that they're cooking and cooling? Whole bunch of different steps there you'd want to think about whether they have control, as opposed to whether they buy it pre-made. If they're opening a resource kind of container, pretty straightforward process. So understanding how they're making their food is really going to help you to set your goals for that and priorities for your inspection. And of course, it's really important to set a good example. We talk about hand washing. If we walk into facilities and we haven't washed our hands, we are sending the message that it's all talk and I don't really mean it. So that's really an important thing to keep in mind as well. And it's important to encourage the managers within these kitchens to do that too, because the employees, they're watching all the time. And if the manager's not doing it, they figure it out pretty quick. It's all talk. It's not really something that really matters. Okay. We'll talk about each of these steps, things that can really help you to focus and establish those priorities, previous history of problems, the menu, doing a walkthrough to see what's happening now, and how to ask some specific questions. And we call them inspection reports. Again, having an understanding of that specific operation and what has been some of the challenges that they've been facing yesterday, 3 days ago, can really help you detect any patterns or any lack of that active managerial control for that particular operation, so that you can really follow up to see whether they have been able to get it under control. So, for instance, if they have a reefer that you know has been running warm, Did they have a system to detect that, or were you the one who had to find it? They should have a system set up so that they get that first and tell you about it before you realize it. If that doesn't happen and you're the one, how would you get them to get that monitored so that that doesn't keep happening and you have to keep being responsible for it? Those kinds of things to understand what the history is. Again, I talked about the menu. That really is going to help you understand the high-risk processes, but you're going to have to ask some questions about that to really understand, is it something that they're doing on site or something actually that's straightforward that's pre-made somewhere else. And the other thing, I think, understanding the menu, what they may be working on right now, maybe cooking burgers, is what you're seeing right now, but knowing the menu and what they're going to serve tomorrow may make you want to come back later on. So, for instance, if they're going to, make chili in the afternoon for the next day, and you know that's going to be cooled down that night and reheated for service, if you know that's on the menu and that's how they do it, you might want to pop in later that night to see how they're cooling that. Just helps you focus. Again, that quick walkthrough. Talked about that static versus dynamic, understanding in your walkthrough what they're working on right now, what's really happening right this moment. Here's my chance to really evaluate whether they have control of this, and let the static things kind of sit and deal with those when you have time. You may see things you didn't realize that they did, and you may, again, find things that you want to make a note of and come back later to address them, because they're not the priorities at that moment. And again, taking that kind of mental note of what you're seeing and how great is the risk, whether it's something that it won't be here later, this is my only chance to see it, or whether it will hold for me and I can deal with it later, and what kind of methods and needs are really getting in the way and contributing to any problems that you're running into. And there are some questions, some key questions to ask about. Is there anything in the oven, and when is it going to come out? That would be important to know. So maybe you can pop back in if it's going to take a couple hours to see how they're evaluating their final cook. Cooling's a tough one. The cooling parameters in the code require that they get it to 70 in 2 hours, and then a maximum of 6 down to 41. Have an understanding of when they're doing it is important in being able to ensure that their system is working and that it's doing it properly. Reheating, that typically is going on in the morning, not so much in the evenings, or maybe it's different in your camps, but for most commercial operations, being there at the right time to evaluate that, and of course receiving as well. When does that happen? So you want to be accurate in your observations and ask open-ended questions. Asking the employees about, instead of saying, do you cook this chicken to 165, what do you cook the chicken to? To see if they have any idea, if they really know. I think that's one of the ones about chicken. I always hear like 160. You can see them sort of scrambling to get that number right. They don't really know. And that just gives you some information about that degree of active managerial control, and that the manager in that facility may need to do some additional training. And make sure they've got the proper critical limits, and is what you're seeing matching the critical limits that they are supposed to be hitting. It's about supporting that operator and making sure that they can develop an active managerial control system to really get control over these risk factors. It's more than simply code compliance, providing that operator an opportunity to think about how, for instance, they're going to deal with that reefer that isn't working and detect it on their own, that is not something that you should be the one to identify. They should have a system in place to make sure that that is monitored, that people are trained on how to do it, what to do when it's wrong, and that somebody is overseeing it within their system. Again, open-ended questions. We run into situations all the time where you have operations where you don't find the violations, but you know they have no active managerial control. and that they just got lucky today that nothing was wrong. But it is a ticking time bomb, and eventually this isn't a system that will hold. So understanding and assessing those strengths and weaknesses within their food safety operation is going to really help them improve. Chapter 2 talks about the duties of the person in charge, and I know that's a requirement with your system, that they do provide, your food operators are providing monitoring and daily oversight, temperature charts, those kinds of things. I think one of the things I talked with some of the groups at the training about would be to sort of expand that beyond some of the holding temperatures of the units and get cooking logs, cooling logs, those kinds of things as next steps to really improve that system. I think that's more for state and local inspectors. I want to talk about some other tools that we've developed to work with your operators, and this is our oral culture learner project. One of the things that we came across was some research that had been done by Dr. Donna Beagle that talked about the differences between print and verbal culture learners, and that for us as inspectors, we tend to be print culture, give out pamphlets, codes, those kinds of things, and that it's not particularly motivating to those frontline employees. Managers of these operations, of your food service facilities, usually are print culture like us. But those frontline employees, it's not really, that chart, that graph doesn't really get them excited. The problem is that they're the ones making the food. And even though they often know what they're supposed to do, they have conflicting priorities themselves. Got to hurry, got to save money, don't want to waste. And they make a decision every single time about whether they're going to follow those food safety procedures or not, because they're not watched every single second. And that we wanted to develop something to have them understand the consequences of the choices that they make about whether they follow, wash their hands, cook all the way, all those kinds of things, about why it's important and what the consequences are for those decisions, even when no one's watching. So that was what this project was really designed to get at, not how to wash your hands, but why it's really important. Most of that food safety information that they get is presented by somebody in a position of power and who doesn't really understand how hard it can be when you've got 200 people in line to stop and wash your hands. It is hard. And it's, again, good behavior is often not modeled. If we don't do it, if the management doesn't do it, if it's not, paper towels aren't available, why should I bother? A lot of the food safety training that they get explains how to do it, but doesn't get to that why, the consequences. And if they do, it's too technical, and it doesn't really, it's just not motivating. It's charts and graph stuff. We do classroom computer-based training for food handler cards, pamphlets, those kinds of things, how-to posters, and again, that people of power are the ones telling them to do it. So here's an example to take a look at. It's in Spanish. I'm not fluent in Spanish, but it doesn't matter. But you think about those characteristics. These are the kind of thing you might see. If you look at it, you see that it's really good in the how-to, right? Nice pictures. It's got some descriptions here, and it's colorful, but is it really compelling as why I should do this when I have 200 people waiting to eat? Not especially. So what we tried to do was to develop some posters. We did this with focus groups that would stay away from the how-to because we think they exist already. We're not going to try to recreate those, but really get at that behavior change in the why. So here's an example, and again, this is for your frontline employees, of a situation where we show the wrong way on the poster and what happens, the consequences, and the right way. He's got the gloves on for ready-to-eat food. And the little girl is fine. No writing, they don't have to read. Simple, clear messages with the wrong way and the right way. Some of them we have more writing because it's a more complex story. Here's another example about an employee who comes to work sick. And of course he's got the bare hand contact again. and we see what had happened. The little girl became ill, consequences of this. This is a lot of writing, and the focus groups, they said that's a lot. I don't really want to read all that. So we tried to make the pictures stand on their own, but some of the stories are a little more complex. Now, this was one of the favorites from our focus groups. They really liked the visual. It's simple, tells you what's wrong. We don't have to read a whole bunch of story stuff. Little guy eats it, and he gets sick. We see the consequences, and over here we explain how to do it right. These posters are available on our website, and something you can hand out to reinforce these behaviors with your operators. And we also developed some videos, and I'm going to try to run one here real quick for you and see if this works. It worked. My husband and I tested this out last night, and I think it should. We have 3 videos online, and we will be developing some more. And again, it was getting at the same idea of the why, and so that not to tell people how to do things safely, but the consequences if they don't. Let me see if I can get this to work, and if it doesn't, if you can't hear the sound, let me know.
Listeria monocytogenes is the 3rd leading cause of foodborne-related deaths in the U.S. Bernadette and Kate are survivors.
I am Bernadette Jacobs. I contracted listeriosis when I was 32 weeks pregnant with my 3rd child from food poisoning. I ate a sandwich. I ate something as simple as a sandwich. My kids had sports practices, and we were running in 50 million different directions that night, and we stopped at a sandwich shop. The rest of my family had become sick to their stomachs after we had eaten dinner at a particular place, and we all had similar meals. And so we figure 99% sure that that's where it came from. Because my immune system was depleted and I wasn't in premium health because I was pregnant, it just made me that much sicker than it would have anyone else. And they figured out it was listeria, and they figured out that listeria, being a foodborne illness, is where it was. They asked me at that point to write down everything I'd eaten for 35 days. The first time I went to see the doctor, when I initially was ill with listeria, I was told that I'd simply gained too much weight being pregnant. I'd only gained 38 pounds, which being 32 weeks gestation was not that much. It wasn't my first child, so I knew that there was something wrong. There was something just plain wrong. I was short of breath. I couldn't function the way I normally did. Never in a million years did I think it was connected to anything I ate, not anything that I contracted. I just thought there was something wrong with the pregnancy. When I went to the hospital that Saturday, which was 2 days after I was at the doctor's office, I initially had been dismissed again. I went to the emergency room, and they thought that I had a sinus infection. They thought that it was just typical pregnancy symptoms, and I kept insisting, no, there's something wrong. There's something more wrong. A nurse that I knew came into the room. Our kids had gone to preschool together, and she recognized me, and she said, this isn't you. There's something definitely wrong. This isn't you. She took the initiative, and within 30 minutes after she called the head of fetal medicine, he was there and insisting on an emergency C-section. It came back that it had turned into bacterial meningitis, and it was from listeriosis, and it turned into sepsis in both the baby and myself. And at this point, they were just trying to treat both of us and save us both. When Kate was born, they initially knew that there was something wrong with the placenta, the fluids, everything else. And within 3 days of blood work, which during this time it was just a whirlwind, it was a nightmare with how sick the baby was and critical, and we didn't think she'd live hour to hour. I felt awful. I felt absolutely awful. My baby was dying. They gave us about a 15% chance that she would make it at all. And even if she did, the outlook was grim. She was supposed to be a quadriplegic. She was supposed to never function. She was supposed to be brain dead. And luckily, babies are resilient. And she healed, day by day. It was a very slow process. We spent every day, every night, every waking hour in and out of that hospital. My husband right by my side the whole time. we thought she was getting better. We had gone from thinking that she was going home to having a team of doctors surrounding her telling us she still might not make it. When they figured out she had hydrocephalus, it was because her head started swelling just gradually. And by the time we went to Ann Arbor, her spinal fluid still wasn't normal. They did a Macomb reservoir in her head at first, on the left side of her head, and they would actually do a ventricular tap to it every day, which meant that they would lay her down with a needle and tap that spot in her brain and take out so many cc's of spinal fluid every day to try to get her body to produce new spinal fluid. We don't know that we're not going to end up there next month. I mean, every day we're lucky to have Kate the way she is. Kate has done leaps and bounds more than we ever thought she would. We've gone from 4 days a week of physical therapy, where I couldn't work to take her to therapies, to adjusting to having her therapies done at our real estate office. So that way she's actually with every realtor. We've joked that it takes a real estate office to raise a baby, not a village. Right now, we just hope that Kate stays as healthy as she is for us right now, and that the next surgery is as successful. She didn't walk till she was 3.5 because she had no depth perception. They went in through her eyes and operated on her cranial nerves, and she got up and walked. And so Kate's had little successes along the way that have made huge impact for us. At this point, I still have issues with my pancreas. I have scar tissue in my lungs from it. I have things like that you would never think of. I mean, I'm 32 years old. I shouldn't have to worry about being able to breathe properly. If you're handling food in a kitchen, if you are preparing a sandwich for somebody, when you're dealing with lunch meats in particular, the temperature of them is so important. The temperature at which they must be kept at and the longevity that you keep them is so important. And when they tell you that something has to be thrown out after a certain amount of time, it has to be. There's no keeping it longer to, stop waste in your restaurant. There's no saving a few extra dollars. You can kill someone. You can absolutely make someone so sick from food poisoning that they will die. Who knew that food poisoning could cause it? Who knew? I mean, I had no idea that getting a takeout sandwich could have changed my life.
So again, that's an example of one of the videos. We have 2 others on there. Again, designed to get to that frontline employee without a lot of technical information, no charts, no graphs, but to have them feel the impact of making those decisions about keeping food cold, about cooking foods properly, about washing your hands, that they really can have life and death effects on others. Go back to the slideshow. Just got one more slide. I did want to give you a little update. The supplement to the 2013 food code should be out this summer with some updated changes. I can't talk about what those would be. They're not really. They don't want us to really speculate until it's actually been approved. But we would expect it sometime in this summer. We also have a food code reference system that's now available on our website, and I put the website there. This is a searchable database that will give you an opportunity to go in and see what we call our interpretations on the food code. Sometimes there are specific questions about how it should be applied. For instance, those of you familiar with like a Papa Murphy's type pizza operation, all that product is ready to eat. It's all fully cooked. They assemble the pizzas, but it's going to be cooked later. Because it's ready to eat, do they actually have to have the no bare hand contact, or because it's going to be cooked later, is it not required? Those kinds of interpretations and questions are all available on there, and that's open to the public. That's really it, and I am finished, and I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to present, and I don't know if we have time for questions or not. I'll kick it back to you, Martin.
I think we do have some time. We have a couple minutes before the break, official break, but I think if people still have questions that would be of interest, they're certainly welcome to ask Katey, and I appreciate you being here. That was an excellent presentation, but we can go ahead and let you take questions, otherwise people go unheard. And let's see, Josh, can you help me out? I'm trying to get back to the attendees to see if there are any questions. Do you see any out there?
Sure, yeah, a few people have written in a few questions. I can just read them off. The first
Sure.
first one comes from Rob Griffith, and he says, "So, does it simply make more business sense to get out of the food preparation slash handling slash sack lunch workload associated with incidents and just provide MREs for incidents?"
I think you guys have some significant challenges, and when I've done the live courses, we've spent quite a bit of time talking about this. I think that it needs to be communicated quick. I wouldn't advocate for nothing but MREs. I don't think that's fair, and I don't think it's necessary. I think there are some other options. For instance, and I just played that video with the listeria with the luncheon meats. There are some real concerns about it, and time is really the key piece to really, whether it's labeling or education, if you're talking about sending those sandwiches out, that they know that there is a time, keeping them cold, holding temperature as long as you can, but once they are in whatever the backpacks, and they are out of temperature control, that they really have a maximum of 4 hours. Depending on, we say 6 hours up to 70 degrees, but I know it's going to be very hot out there for them, so 4 hours would probably be a good thing. They need to get them eaten or don't eat them. Then they need the MREs. And again, understanding the risks and the organisms will help to kind of set up those policies of how you're going to address it. But I'm not an advocate for giving nothing but an MRE.
Okay. Next question is from Tom Johnston. And he says, safety officers are weakest in food and we rely on your expertise. When do you recommend that we, meaning logistics and safety, ask the county/state health department to come to our city to do an invited inspection? And by city, cities in parentheses.
Right away. Setting up those kinds of connections is going to be a huge advantage. And, I'm just going to be honest here. I'm sure there are people out there who have run into maybe negative experiences with some of the locals. It's not a perfect, human beings are imperfect. But if you can set up those relationships early, there are many of them that would come out there and do all kinds of work for you that would be really, really interested. They see it as their role to protect the public health in their community and to assist. As early on as you can contact them, I can help you. If you need a list of the officials, I don't know how many people are, how many states are represented on this call, but I could coordinate that with my counterparts and get you lists for all the state and local contacts, certainly within our Pacific region.
And Katey, why don't you can send that through me, Martin Miracle here, and I'll get that out to the whole everyone who is on the mailing list. That would be significant.
Okay, I will do that, and you might start too with in the off season reaching out maybe to the state officials and say, we do want to have this relationship with them and before we have the fires. So when you have downtime, to kind of not when it's in a pressure cooker, to see what makes sense. And some of them may opt out and say, you know what? If we're not getting a license, we can't afford it, and that's kind of maybe the tough world they're in, that they can't help. But I think you'll find a lot of them will.
Perfect. Hey, Josh, before you ask the next written one, let me call on Jim Newman because he has his hand up. I'm going to go ahead and mute him. Jim Newman, did you have a question? You had your hand up. Jim Newman. Okay, back to you, Josh. We'll try him again.
Okay. This is a long one, but I'll read it out here. And this is from Slack Girl. Question: why have we gone to the cardboard, plastic-lined food containers rather than keeping the plastic buckets? In food serving settings, the boxes do not hold temperatures as well. The chance of serving contamination has increased due to the restricted surface area of the box opening. Arms, skin, or clothing coming in contact with the opening and sides of the container, securing the food to restricted contamination during extended serving times. Securing the food to restrict contamination during extended serving times due to intermittent crew arrival times. And then there's the issue of the boxes collapsing when wet. Another area of concern are the cheap plastic serving utensils that break during use, resulting in having to use parts of the utensil cups or gloved hands to serve with.
Yeah, that's not for me. I heard this was discussed when we were in Redmond a month ago as well, but that's not something I can respond to.
Okay.
More of a comment for consideration, I think, for managing that.
Probably the contracting officer, Kellen Logan, maybe. Since that one's in writing, Josh, maybe I'll make sure I get that somehow and get that to Kellen Logan and company.
Okay.
Do you have any others?
Steve Warden has his hand up. Let's see if I can unmute him. Go ahead, Steve. Steven. Steven, you there? Okay.
Let's try, see if Jim Newman's back there. Let's see, where did he go again? Whoops. Gee, he dropped off my list somehow. Jim Newman had his hand up. Oh, maybe he went to staff somehow. Nope.
Well, Martin, if you get additional questions, you have my email. You can certainly email those to me. I don't know if you have a way to answer them back, but.
Sure, that's not a problem.
Okay.
What I can do is send, if I end up with 2 or 3, I could send them to you. When you get a reply back to me, I could send it out to the group for their reading pleasure.
Absolutely.
Well, very good. And were there any more written ones, Josh?
Nope, that's it.